All right, so we left off at looking at sweatshops in developing countries. All of the blue shaded countries here are considered developing. This is like the second stage, directly underdeveloped. So there are 3 stages. This is like the intermediate stage of development. So in developing countries, unions and government legislation has assisted in increasing the cost of making garments all over North America and Europe. So minimum wages keep raising, paying people to do overtime. This affects how clothes are made. And people want and demand fashionable clothing at lower and lower price points. And this has resulted in many manufacturers outsourcing their apparel production. So developing countries such as Bangladesh and China, Honduras, India, Vietnam here, they are basically places where the United States, Canada, and Europe has outsourced their garment apparel making. And so this allows for workers in these countries to have certain opportunities, but it also creates some issues. So there is 2 sides to the debate. There is a pro side, to sweatshops, but there's also a con side, which you have probably heard more about. So let's talk pro first. A lot of economists say that sweatshops in the long run will make employees and employers better off because of comparative advantage. If you've taken grade 12 economics, it means that the developing countries benefit economically as factories result in jobs, which in turn improve the standard of living. And so these sweatshops are a significant improvement over other employment options like prostitution or picking through garbage or subsistence farming, which is just like farming to get by. So typically China, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan are countries that have cited benefit from sweatshops because of what we have mentioned before, this comparative advantage. However, there's definitely a strong argument for anti-sweatshops. A lot of sweatshops defy human rights and take advantage of individuals who are not economically fortunate. They lead to slavery, human trafficking, and harsh treatment. A lot of international organizations such as the International Labor Organization, the League of Nations, and the United Nations all sought to get rid of sweatshops. And as we become a more global planet, a lot of people are concerned for the welfare of people in the developing world, the global economy, and the environment. And the environment is factored into this because a lot of developing countries also have looser environmental regulations, which means that they can pollute more easily than we can here in North America. This pollution also impacts the people living in the area, so we see problems with the health of citizens in some of these regions, such as birth defects and chronic illnesses and even death. So there's also a gender component to sweatshop employees because a lot of them are typically young women who have to leave school and move to urban centers. These women have little legal or family support, and it also creates a cycle of poverty because if they have children, then they are less likely to be able to provide for them, and then those daughters are more likely to head out and try and support their families, and just ends up being this vicious cycle. Sweatshops in your shopping experience. If you've shopped, you have likely bought something from a sweatshop. It's really hard to find out which companies use sweatshops to produce clothing because the fashion industry is so global. There are so many moving pieces, and it's really hard to know every little piece of it. And even companies themselves don't know every little piece of it. A lot of companies remain ignorant because they subcontract their labor out. And so that means that they hire someone to find people to make clothing. So they don't even really know who's making the clothing all of the time. And they're also not liable for the conditions and the treatment of the employees. So it kind of ends up being this out of sight, out of mind thing. Reading clothes labels is great, and that's what a lot of people would do when they're trying to figure out if their clothes have been made in a sweatshop. But made in Canada doesn't necessarily mean that there were safe and fair practices all along the way. That means that the garment might have been assembled in Canada, but the cotton that was spun in a sweatshop. So made in Canada can be kind of misleading because there are so many different aspects in the making. There are also sweatshops in Canada as well, so that made in Canada's tag does not necessarily mean that it wasn't made in a sweatshop in Canada. So if you are really concerned about your clothes and the ethics of your closet, there are some questions that you can ask your retailer to hopefully make a more informed decision. Some of them are asking about subcontracting, so you could ask them if they subcontract out the production of their clothes. You could also ask if they know what countries produce the clothing that your company sells. You could ask them if they have a list of factories and locations that make your clothing. Or you could ask more pointedly if they have a code of conduct that protects the rights of its workers, protects against fair wages, protects against child labor. All of those questions might help you understand whether or not that company is abiding by the morals that you want to live by. Another way to look is you could look at lawsuits. There's a ton of apparel companies that have lawsuits pending against them, and since it's a lawsuit, this information is readily accessible on the internet. So you could also look up your favorite clothing companies and see if they have lawsuits pending against them in regards to the use of sweatshops in foreign countries. If you are looking at information regarding sweatshops, you have to keep in mind that every issue has at least two perspectives, and embedded in these perspectives is going to be a combination of fact and opinion. So no matter what you're looking at, even if it's in another course, you want to consider the following ideas. Who is the source of the information? Is it a person or an organization? Are they credible? What's their motivation for providing this information? Do they have credentials? Do they have background knowledge? Who is giving this information and what's their story? The what is also complicated. You need to know what they're specifically writing about. Is it consistent? Is it supported by evidence? Or is it very general and based on opinion? You could look at quantitative evidence or qualitative. Quantitative usually looks at numbers and statistics, and qualitative usually looks at like interviewing subjects and personal anecdotes. Either one is valid, and a good researcher will look at both and look at multiple viewpoints. Why is another thing to consider. Why are they writing about this subject? Are they writing to highlight an issue? Are they writing to inform? Are they writing to persuade? Are they trying to call people to action? Are they trying to instill fear? What is the purpose of what they're writing? When are they writing? This is huge. Is the source current? Are the references they've used current? Someone could write an essay based off of all information from 1960, and then that information wouldn't be as credible as something that was written more recently. So when are they writing, and when were the references that they are using written? Where and how are the last thing I want to talk about. Where is more like what type of organization is instrumental in publishing this information. Is it like a government of Canada? is there a .ca, .gc, .gov? When you're looking on the internet, you want to understand the component parts of the actual URL. So there are certain URLs that are better than others. The last thing that I wanted to mention is just leaving you with a number. 250 million is the number of children between the ages of 5 and 14 who are working in developing countries. I kept this number as it was because I wanted you to just think of child labor as a whole, not necessarily in relation to the manufacturing of fashion. This presentation isn't me saying that all of fashion is bad and the fashion industry is the only culprit. There are a lot of different industries that employ child labor to do things that they want at a cheaper price, and so this is a global problem, and we're not talking about a few children, we're talking about a lot of children. So I think that's it for Unit 4. At the end of Unit 4, we're going to be doing a fun task that involves deconstructing. So have fun with that, and we can end the unit on a high note.